Okay, today's lecture is pulmonary ventilation. Folks, when I say ventilation, what do you think of? Air. Yeah, like this room has vents in it. We have a ventilation system that it's responsible for moving air through. Our ventilation system in the school is purpose is to change the temperature in the room. You know, there's ventilation systems in different industrial buildings. Their job is just to make sure that air moves in and out so that there's fresh air coming in. You may have like you may be working with a paint or a chemical that says, make sure to use this in a well-ventilated area so you don't breathe too many of the fumes. What this means is movement of air. Specifically with pulmonary ventilation, we're talking about movement of air to and from the respiratory surfaces. And where the respiratory surfaces are is in that alveolus there, where the gases can be exchanged between the bloodstream and the airspace in the alveolus, or ultimately the environment. Now, on the primer, the first primer I gave you, I have this air moves in, and over here I have the chest expands. Okay? One of these was a cause, and the other one was an effect. Some of you all got this right, and some of you all got this wrong. I didn't take any points off, but which one of these is the cause? The chest expanding is the cause. Air moving in is the effect. Now, I thought forever that it was the other way around, because you breathe in, you see your chest expanding, so you think, oh, maybe it's expanding because the air is moving in. That's not what's happening. Air moves in as a result of the chest expanding. Okay? And the law that governs this is Boyle's law. Now, I want to talk about that here in just a second, but I want to put down just a little bit of anatomy here in the center, okay? So draw this kind of makeshift dome here with me, and we're going to put this muscle right there. Okay, here's the chest cavity, aka the thoracic cavity. Down here at the bottom is a muscle. This muscle is what separates the chest cavity or thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. What is the name of that muscle? That is the diaphragm. Only a couple of holes in the diaphragm. One of them is for the aorta to pass through, another one is for the esophagus to pass through. But diaphragm, you might be familiar with the diaphragm when it spasms and causes things like hiccups, okay? But the diaphragm is the muscle that you were flexing at the beginning of the hour when I said take a deep breath in. That muscle pulls down to allow the chest cavity to expand. Now I'm going to draw a simplified version of this. We're going to draw a lung on each side. I'm not going to worry about the anatomy of each individual lung for our purposes here. The purpose for this is just to show you how these are going to move in and out and label some of the surrounding area thereof. Okay, I'm leaving out some important features here, namely that the heart fills this space in between the two so well, in fact, there's really no space surrounding it. It's pretty much everything's packed right into place, and the only extra room is created by the fact that our chest cavity actually expands. Now, we talked about connective tissues being peritoneum, and the name of peritoneum changing based on stuff that it surrounds. When it was around muscles, we called it endomysium and paramysium and epimysium. Around the heart, it was pericardium. Around the bones, it's periosteum. Around the lungs, so connective tissue, that surrounds the lungs is called pleura, P-L-E-U-R-A, pleura. All right, I'm also going to draw this somewhat imperfect line that's going to separate these two. Now, it's not located exactly right there, but it does separate right and left lung. In fact, it is continuous with the bag that surrounds the heart. This dividing line that separates right and left lung makes two separate cavities, and it's called the mediastinum. Mediastinum is really important because if one lung collapses, it can no longer draw air in. But the good news is, because they're both kind of packaged separately as a result of the mediastinum, if one collapses, the other one will not collapse. They're both managed separately. Now, the pleura that surrounds the entire lung, okay, it's called the visceral pleura. Oh, I think I misspelled that. It was supposed to be EU. I'm going to start over. P-L-E-U-R-A. Visceral pleura. Surrounds entire lung on both sides. So, who touched the lung the other day? Put their hands on it. Your fingers were in direct contact with the visceral pleura of that lung. Now, on the outside here, and I'm going to have a little bit more room on this side, so that's where I'm going to put it. On the outside, lining the inside of the chest wall here, is something called parietal pleura. Surrounds chest wall. So these surfaces are constantly going to be in contact with one another. The space that surrounds these lungs is almost non-existent, because as soon as space is formed here, it disappears, because this space, named the pleural cavity, is more or less, and again, this is not perfect, so don't think it's a perfect vacuum, but it's a vacuum. Pleural cavity is a vacuum, which means that pretty much if the chest wall goes out, the lung will follow with it, because there's very, very little, if any, air in this space. There is a little bit of fluid called serous exudate that lives, it's fluid, it's not alive, that is in this space, and it has about the consistency of tears. It's going to be wet, salty, with a little bit of, with lipids in it. And its job is to lubricate between the two, because as the chest wall, if this hand represents the lung, and my other hand represents the chest wall, as we breathe in, this is what would happen. The lung is going to slide past that. Now, sometimes there are little portions of the lung or the chest wall that are a little irritated or rough, or they're not as well lubricated. And that sometimes will cause a catch in that. Have you guys ever been at a place where you wanted to take a deep breath, but if you did, it was really kind of sharp? But if you didn't take a deep breath, it didn't hurt at all. But then when you try to breathe in a little bit deeper, it kind of got a sharp pain there, and then it goes away in a little bit. It's called a pleurisy. And a pleurisy is where it's either a little non-lubricated section of the lung or chest wall, or there's a little something that is developed inside of there that makes it like catch or stick on there rather than sliding back and forth in the way it should. But this space is supposed to be a vacuum, because if we can control the size of the chest cavity, we can control which way the air moves. Okay, I'm gonna take it out here for just a little bit, and then to bring it back in. Okay, you don't need to draw this, but I've got this little Shop Vac right here. All right, it's a terrible looking Shop Vac. All right, the purpose of a Shop Vac is, of course, to pick up stuff, right, to vacuum things. Well, here's what the motor is doing in a Shop Vac. You have this canister here, right? The motor, its job is to push air out of this canister. That's its job, is to create low pressure inside of the canister, which forces the atmosphere to push things into the vacuum hose, because nature tries to seek equilibrium with pressure constantly. So if we're pushing air out of here, air wants to move in there to go into this, and it'll pick up stuff in the interim. Well, we don't exactly have a motor that's going to be shoving air out from one end so we can bring it in the other end. So we need to control how air moves using a law here, okay? Those that have chemistry may have just recently talked about the law. The law that governs gas movement into and out of the lungs is what? Pressure and volume. Who is that? Boyle's law. And we're not going to need to do any problem solving with formulas. In fact, I'm not even going to write the exact formula up here. It's just going to be a very, as volume increases, pressure will do what? Pressure decreases. That volume and pressure have an inverse relationship. Okay, in the anatomy version of this, not in the chemistry version of it, because the chemistry version is a lot more complicated. There's equations and stuff like that involved. Let me just give you the cliff notes here. Let's say we have this fixed container of gas. Okay, I'm going to put 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to put 10 gas molecules in here. Could be oxygen, nitrogen, whatever. Gas molecules are gas molecules because they're constantly on the move, constantly bouncing off of each other and off of the sides of whatever container they're in. Okay? Well, let's say that instead, well, pause for a second. The pressure in this container is defined by how many of these collisions are going to occur. So the more gas, the more collisions occur, the higher the pressure. But let's say I take that same fixed volume of gas and I put it in a smaller container. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? Will there be more or less collisions? There will be more collisions. And as a result, higher pressure. So, this one is greater volume, which means what? Lower pressure. This one is lower volume, which means greater pressure. I have in my garage a compressor, which I air up the tires of our vehicles with and run an air nailer with. And basically, I fire it up, and it runs a motor and a piston that drives air, compresses air into a tank so that it's compressed and ready to come out of there. It is basically putting a higher volume of gas a higher quantity of gas molecules into a small space, trying to pressurize them. Okay, well, how does this work with lungs? Any movement, we need muscles to make that happen. So that's what we're going to do, okay? Muscles of breathing. There are really two major muscles or groups of muscles involved in breathing. One I already told you. What's the big one? The diaphragm. Diaphragm will contract downward to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. That's what it's doing. when it contracts, it pulls downward, and it increases the thoracic cavity volume. Now, we have two sets of muscles that you have to think opposite to understand how they work. And if you remember it that way, you won't forget it, okay? They're called intercostal muscles. We have external and internal. All right? These muscles, inter means between, costal means ribs. So these muscles are in between your ribs. Okay? So they will contract to raise or lower the rib cage and either increase or decrease the volume. Now here's where it's kind of messed up. The external intercostals are used for inhaling. The internal intercostals are used for exhaling. See how that's confusing? Unless you just think of it as opposite. Okay? How can you have muscles that are in the same spot do the opposite function? It has everything to do with where their origin and their insertion is. Let me show you. Okay? The external intercostals, their origin is on the rib above, their insertion is on the rib below. So when they contract, each one of them is lifting up the rib cage in that spot, is pulling the whole rib cage up. Whereas the internal intercostals have their origin and insertion reversed from that. So basically, what they do is when they contract, each of them are pulling the ribs back down, and then the diaphragm relaxes to put the lung space or the thoracic cavity back to that normal size. So here's the deal. So when we inhale, now this is an interesting word here, okay? So during inspiration, I love this word. I love this word. To inspire. Inspire means, of course, just to inhale or breathe in. So, but it has very old roots, this word does. What do you think that is the root of?
Ride a horse.
Spirit? Oh, spurs? Okay, all right. This root is the same root as the word spirit. And this goes back a very long ways because breath was so closely associated with spirit, the spirit of a person. That goes back to the biblical account of creation, back when Adam was formed of the dust of the ground, and then what happened? Anybody? According to the biblical account, after he formed from the dust of the ground, breath of life was breathed into his nostrils. So the association between breath and spirit has been around for millennia, which is also, guess what it means to exhale? What word were used for that? Expire, which both means to exhale and also to die, because the spirit leaves. All right. Anyway, to inhale, okay, the diaphragm contracts. Downward. Ribs lift up and increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. Pressure, as a result, does what? Does what? Pressure decreases. air moves in to equalize. All right. During expiration, or exhaling, diaphragm relaxes, ribs pull down, decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. Pressure then as a result does what? Anyone? Pressure increases. Air leaves to equalize. Air leaves to equalize pressure. Okay? Got a couple brief definitions for you. I'm going to show you a little quick animation of one of them here at the end. This word it reminds me a little bit of emetropia, because emetropia is like, it's a strange sounding condition. It just means perfect vision. This one is eupnea. Just means quiet breathing. And during eupnea, those are really the only muscles we're going to end up using, are just those intercostals and diaphragm. But if you've ever exerted yourself, and you probably have, you've gone through hyperpnea, which is forced breathing. After an athletic event or something that really took a lot of energy out of you, you have to really breathe hard and fast to get it back. Now, it's not so important to me that you memorize all of these muscles. I just want you to know that there's several more muscles that are involved in that. You can feel it too. If you've ever breathed really hard, you can feel it like in your shoulders and your neck and in your abs, because there's several other muscles involved. When you start forcing the breathing, you employ the sternocleidomastoid, scalene, pectoralis minor, transversus thoracis, serratus anterior, as well as the rectus abdominis muscles. There's a whole bunch of other muscles involved when you really start breathing super hard. Okay, last thing I want to throw in here is what happens if air or other fluids end up in that pleural cavity. What do we call that? The lung goes from this to that. What's that? Collapsed lung. Do you guys remember the word for that? It's on your first primer, I think. It's called a pneumothorax, which literally means air chest. Collapsed lung. Air or other fluid and pleural cavity. That's a collapsed lung. Okay. What happens is this, in that space that surrounds the lung right there, if there is a hole in this chest wall and this space is a vacuum, air is going to flow, air is going to flow into this space here that surrounds the lung and cause the lung to shrink back on itself. Okay, I made this little model here. Okay, this is to try to show you how this happens, like how breathing happens. I just took this water bottle that I found in the recycling bin. I used gloves. See, there's one here and one down here. the water bottle I found in here, and basically I inverted this one and cut the top off of it, put it in this space, and this one down here I sealed at the bottom. So this is to represent like the lungs, this space around the pleural cavity, and down here the diaphragm. Now, watch what happens if I push up on the diaphragm, okay, and as I pull out on it. The lungs will expand and collapse just because of the change in pressure in that fixed space that surrounds them. Okay?